the Orphan Trains, the repopulation of a buried world. The generation without a past. The silence of the majestic cities. Imagine you are standing in the middle of San Francisco, Chicago, or New York City in the year 1850. You look up and you see architecture that defies explanation. Massive stone cathedrals, 10-story government buildings with intricate carvings, and vast, paved boulevards designed for thousands of people. These are cities built with the precision of a master jeweler, utilizing Antiquitech, features like copper domes and atmospheric energy spires. But then, you look at the streets, they are nearly empty. The people you do see are living in the mud. They are driving wooden carts through streets designed for high-speed transit. They are living in the basements of palaces they don't know how to build. History tells us these people were pioneers who built these cities with horse-drawn carriages and handsaws, but the math doesn't add up. You don't build a 500-room stone parliament building while you're still struggling to find clean water. This is the empty city paradox. Throughout the mid-19th century, the architects of the New World found themselves in possession of massive, pre-existing stone cities that had been reset, likely by the Great Mudflood. The infrastructure was there, the power grid was there, but the people were gone. They had a world-class hardware system, but they were missing the software. They needed a new population. They needed people who had no memory of the world before the reset. They needed a tabula rasa, a blank slate. And that is when the trains began to roll. The 250,000 foundlings. Between 1,854 and 1,929, an estimated 250,000 children were rounded up from the streets of East Coast cities like New York and Boston. They were packed into wooden rail cars and shipped thousands of miles into the American West. The official narrative, led by figures like Charles Loring Brace and the Children's Aid Society, tells a story of charity. They say the cities were overcrowded, filled with street urchins and waifs whose parents had died in the slums. They say these children were being sent to good Christian homes in the Midwest to learn the value of hard work. But let's look closer at the numbers. 250,000. That is a staggering population displacement. Where did these children come from? If the cities were so empty and new, why were they suddenly overflowing with hundreds of thousands of parentless children? In the world of Antiquitech, we ask the forbidden question. Were these children actually orphans, or were they the incubator generation? Across the United States, historical records from this era are filled with foundling hospitals and orphan asylums that appeared overnight. These institutions were more like processing centers. The children were stripped of their original names. Their birth records were lost or never created. Their family histories were erased. They were being prepared for a mass repopulation. They were the seeds being planted in the empty cities of the West to claim the inheritance of the previous civilization. The reset narrative, erasing the old world. Why was it so important to use children? Because children are easy to program. If you take an adult who remembers the old world, who remembers how the star forts actually functioned, who remembers the free energy of the ether, or who saw the mudflood with their own eyes, that adult is a threat to the new order. They cannot be controlled. But a child? A 5-year-old child who has been traumatized, separated from their family, and told that they were saved from the gutter? That child will believe whatever you tell them. The orphan trains were a cultural hard drive wipe. By the time these children reached their destinations in Nebraska, Kansas, or Texas, they had been given a new story. They were told that the majestic stone ruins they saw around them were newly built by their pioneer fathers. They were taught a history that began in 1776 and ignored everything that came before. The architects used these 250,000 children to occupy the pre-existing infrastructure of the Tartarian or Antiquitech world. These kids became the farmers, the factory workers, and the soldiers who would defend a history they didn't know was a lie. They were the first generation of the reset. They were the ones who turned the old world into the American dream, never realizing they were standing on the graves of their own ancestors. The auction block. Human commodities. When the orphan trains arrived at a station, it wasn't a warm homecoming, it was a human auction. The children were lined up on wooden platforms, often in local town halls or churches, and local farmers would come to inspect them. They checked their teeth. They felt their muscles. They looked for the strongest ones to work the fields. The siblings were often separated, never to see each other again. Official history calls this outplacement. We call it asset distribution. These children were being distributed like biological units to maintain the newly claimed land. The architects didn't care about their emotional well-being. They cared about productivity. They needed a workforce to dig out the buried streets, to clear the mud from the basement windows, and to man the factories that were being retrofitted from ancient power plants into coal-burning furnaces. The orphan was the perfect worker. No family to complain, no history to defend, and a deep-seated psychological debt to the system that saved them. This is how you build a nation on top of a lie. You use a generation that has no way to prove the truth. The lost census of 1,890. By the year 1890, the Orphan Train project was in full swing. The first few waves of children had grown up. They were starting families of their own. They were beginning to ask questions. Where did I come from? Why are there no records of my parents? Why does this new city have tunnels and subways that look 1,000 years old? And then a coincidence happened. In 1921, a massive fire broke out in the Department of Commerce building in Washington, D.C. The result? The 1,890 U.S. census was almost completely destroyed. This wasn't just any census. The 1,890 records were the most detailed in American history. They contained the specific data on the origins of the orphan train children, the true population counts of the western empty cities, and the lineage of the families who inherited the land. With the 1,890 census gone, the paper trail was severed. The architects had successfully deleted the system logs of the repopulation project. From that point on, everyone's history in America became a blur of immigrant stories and pioneer myths. The orphan train children became the John Does of history, and the truth of the reset was buried under the ashes of the Commerce Building. The amusement park hatcheries. Step into Coney Island in 1903. Amidst the roller coasters and the freak shows, there is an attraction that draws thousands of paying customers every single day. It isn't a bearded lady or a giant. It is a room full of glass boxes. Inside those boxes are tiny, premature human babies. The sign above the door reads, "Infant Incubators with Living Babies." History tells us that Dr. Martin Couney was a hero, a man who saved thousands of premature infants because real hospitals didn't have the technology or the interest. But look at the glitch in the narrative. Martin Couney was not a doctor. He had no medical license. He was a showman. And for nearly 40 years, he ran Incubator Stations at amusement parks across America, from Atlantic City to the world's fairs. Why was the most advanced, life-saving technology of the 20th century hosted at a carnival? In the Antiquitech paradigm, these weren't rescue stations. They were final assembly lines. These incubators were sophisticated pieces of technology that appeared out of nowhere. Many researchers believe they were salvaged from the ruins of the old world. The architects were using the amusement parks as a front to mask a massive, industrial-scale human cultivation project. They were literally growing the next generation of the American workforce in glass boxes, under the gaze of a distracted public, charging 25 cents a head to fund the operation. The foundling hospitals, factories of the state. While the celebrity babies were on display at Coney Island, a much darker operation was happening in the foundling hospitals of New York, Chicago, and Philadelphia. These weren't hospitals in the modern sense. They were massive, fortress-like structures that occupied entire city blocks. Look at the architecture of the New York Foundling Hospital, built in the 1870s. It looks like a high-tech fortress or a prison. At its peak, this single institution was processing over 1,000 infants a month. Where were they coming from? The official story says desperate mothers left them in cradles at the door. But the math reveals a different reality. The sheer volume of infants suggests a biological manufacturing program. These institutions were the hubs for the orphan trains. The babies were harvested, assigned a serial number, and stored until they were old enough to be shipped west. This was the industrialization of infancy. The architects had created a system where humans were treated as floating capital. By separating the child from the mother at birth, they achieved the ultimate goal of any totalitarian system: the destruction of the biological lineage. A child with no mother is a child who belongs entirely to the state. They were formatting the human hard drive before sending it out to run the software of the new corporate America, the downgraded DNA, from titans to workers. We have discussed the giant skeletons found in the Michigan mines and the Mississippi mounds. We know the old world was inhabited by a larger, more robust, and highly intelligent Titan class of humans. So, what happened to them? Why is the modern human so much smaller, weaker, and easier to control? The Orphan Train Incubator Project provides the answer. Many researchers in the forbidden science community suggest that the 19th century reset involved a genetic downgrade. The infants in the incubators and foundling hospitals were the result of a massive selective breeding or cloning program designed to produce a specific type of human, the worker. They needed a population that was small enough to fit into the retrofitted Antiquitech cities, docile enough to follow orders, and short-lived enough to never accumulate too much old-world knowledge. The orphan was the prototype. They were the first generation of small humans sent to inhabit the ruins of a giant world. This is why the doorways in old buildings are so high, and the ceilings so vast they weren't built for us. We were grown to fit into a world that was too big for us, under the watchful eye of the architects who remained behind the curtain. The erasure of the mother, breaking the bond. The most effective way to reset a civilization is to break the maternal bond. In the ancient old world, Tartaria, family lineage and maternal wisdom were the foundation of society. To build a corporate grid, the architects had to replace the mother with the institution. This is why the 19th century saw the sudden, aggressive rise of social engineering and child welfare laws. They weren't protecting children, they were legalizing the theft of children. By criminalizing poverty, they could declare any old-world family unfit and seize their offspring. The orphan trains were the final stage of this theft. By moving the children thousands of miles away from their origins, the architects ensured that the mother's voice, the voice of tradition, of the ether, and of the true history, was silenced forever. The children were given surrogate parents, who were themselves loyal to the new system. The biological reset was complete. Humanity was no longer a tree with deep roots. It was a crop that could be harvested and replanted whenever the architects decided it was time for a new reset. The language of commerce. Reprogramming the mind. When the children stepped off the orphan trains, they weren't just given new clothes, they were given a new language. While many of the foundlings likely came from diverse backgrounds speaking the old world dialects or even the remnants of the Tartarian language, the architects enforced a strict, standardized English of commerce. In the schools established for these orphans, they were taught a version of history that was safe. They were taught that the earth was a resource to be exploited, that progress required burning coal and oil, and that their primary duty was to be a productive citizen. They were taught to ignore the buried windows and the energy spires. They were programmed to see the majestic stone ruins as scenery rather than technology. By the time the orphan train generation reached adulthood, the amnesia was total. They had been reprogrammed to serve the U.S. corporation, established in 1871, and they had no idea that they were the survivors of a stolen world. They became the pioneers who built America, never realizing they were merely the janitors sent in to clean up and occupy a civilization that was far greater than their own. The 1921 fire, burning the system logs. Every computer has a system log, a record of every file created, every user added, and every change made to the OS. The architects of the New World understood that for their Great Reset to be permanent, they had to delete the logs of the repopulation project. Enter the year 1921. A mysterious fire breaks out in the Department of Commerce in Washington, D.C. Official history calls it a tragic accident. But look at what was destroyed. 99% of the 1,000 1890 U.S. Census. This wasn't just any data. The 1890 census was the first one to use Hollerith punch cards, the ancestor of the modern computer. It contained the most precise data ever collected on the orphan train generation. It tracked exactly where those 250,000 children came from, who their biological parents were, and most importantly, the massive population spikes in Western cities that were supposed to be empty. By burning the 1890 census, the architects wiped the hard drive of American identity. They deleted the evidence of the mass production of children. They ensured that no one could ever prove they were an heir to the old world. From that moment on, you weren't a descendant of a majestic civilization. You were just a citizen of a new corporation with a history that started on a blank page. The 1871 Act, from human to asset. As the orphan trains were rolling across the plains, something was happening in the halls of power in Washington, D.C. In 1871, the Organic Act was passed, secretly transforming the Republic into the U.S. corporation. How does this connect to the orphans? It's simple. The corporation needed collateral. When a child is orphaned or found, they become a ward of the state. In the legal world, a ward is a piece of property. The architects used the orphan train generation as the primary stock for their new corporate system. By stripping these children of their names and families, they turned them into liquid assets. This is the origin of the birth certificate. It's not a record of your birth. It's a title of ownership. You are the orphan of the system, and the U.S. corporation is your foster parent. This is why your name is written in all caps on your ID. It's the designation of a corporate entity, not a living human. The orphan trains weren't a charity. They were a supply chain management system for the global financial grid. The ghost architecture, living in ruins. The orphan train children were sent to live in cities like Denver, Salt Lake City, and Portland. Cities that, according to official history, were built in a few short years by rugged men with hammers. But look at the old world photos of these cities. Does it make sense? Why build a 50-foot-tall marble entryway for a population of 5,000 people who are still riding in wooden wagons? It doesn't. These children were the custodians of the ruins. They were sent to occupy the pre-existing Antiquitech infrastructure, the star forts, the energy domes, and the buried stone buildings. The architects didn't want the children to know how the cities worked. They retrofitted the atmospheric energy spires into decorative steeples. They turned the wireless power nodes into government buildings. They told the orphans, "Your fathers built this with sweat and blood." And because the orphans had no fathers to tell them otherwise, they believed it. We are a civilization of squatters, living in the high-tech ruins of our ancestors. And the orphan trains were the U-Haul trucks that moved us in. Epigenetics. The blood remembers. They burned the census. They took the names. They reprogrammed the history. But there is one thing the architects couldn't delete: the DNA. Modern science is starting to catch up to what the truthers have known for years: epigenetics. Your blood carries the memory of your ancestors. This is why so many people today are waking up. This is why you feel a strange, unexplainable connection to the Antiquitech world when you see a Mudflood building or an old copper dome. You aren't learning this history. You are remembering it. The orphan train generation was traumatized to force them into amnesia, but trauma is also recorded in the DNA. The shattered memory of the old world is pulsing in your veins. They can hide the books, but they cannot hide the vibration. The frequency of the Tartarian world is still there, and as the corporate fence begins to fail, the blood memory of the orphans is starting to download back into our consciousness. The modern orphan breaking the train. The orphan train is still running. The modern education system, the 9-to-5 corporate grind, and the digital reset of social media are just the 21st century versions of those wooden rail cars. They want to keep you as a foundling, a person with no roots, no history, and no power. They want you to believe you are just a consumer in a corporate world. But the reset only works if you stay on the train. When you realize that the orphan train narrative is a lie, you stop being a ward of the state and start being an heir to the world. You aren't a lost child of the gutter. You are the descendant of a civilization that mastered the ether and built the stars. The architects are afraid of you because they know that if the orphans ever reclaim their lineage, the U.S. corporation will go bankrupt overnight. The final wake-up call, reclaiming your name. The Orphan Trains of 1854 to 1929 were the most successful identity theft in human history. They stole the past to own the future. But today, the paper trail is no longer enough to keep the lie alive. Every buried window we find, every ancient copper mine we uncover, and every 33rd parallel ritual we expose is a hammer strike against their reset. You are not an orphan. You are a survivor. You are the living log that they couldn't burn in 1921. It's time to stop looking for charity from the system and start looking for the inheritance that was buried under the mud. The architects have had their turn. Now, the orphans are coming home. And this time, we aren't getting on the train. We're building the grid.